Welcome to my Hemra story channel. Everyone said he married me because I look like his dead first love. After 6 years of marriage, he finally couldn't resist the temptation of youth and appeared in front of me with a young girl. I smiled indifferently and signed the divorce agreement neatly. Later, he told me with tears in his eyes that he had never regarded me as a substitute. Get out of the way, don't disgust me. Our story begins. At the party, I realized something was wrong when everyone started whispering and covering their mouths. I turned around and saw my husband Ethan Blake walking arm in arm with a girl in a white dress. The girl, Emma Brooks, had a smile on her face and a look of triumph in her eyes when she caught mine. Ethan leaned over to her ear and said something. They both smiled at each other. Their eyes were locked. Ethan walked her out himself. When he walked towards me, the smile on his face almost disappeared. He looked at me and frowned slightly. What are you doing? Why don't you take my arm? After he said that, the burning stares of everyone fell on me. Mr. Blake really hates her. She's so pitiful, see, she doesn't dare say a word. Because she kept pestering the Blake family. Pestering. Back then, Ethan took the initiative to propose to my parents, even going over me. Ethan and I have only met a few times. I was only informed after everything had been decided. I also learned after marriage that he married me because I look like his first love. I looked at Ethan in front of me. He looked indifferent, as if he hadn't heard the mockery of everyone towards me. Ethan's impatience was visible to the naked eye, and his voice rose. Sophie Lane. I pulled the corners of my mouth for the first time in a long time, and under the astonished looks of everyone, I walked out of the banquet hall. Ethan's face was as cold as ice. He moved his body and eventually blended into the crowd, without even looking at me again. In the past, I just thought that Ethan just didn't like me. I never imagined that he already considered me disgusting. Otherwise, why wouldn't he even give me the most basic respect in public? I was wearing a high-end dress and walking down the street, causing passers-by to turn their heads. I couldn't stand the strange looks from others anymore, so I went into the nearest clothing store and bought a loose and comfortable tracksuit. I used the bathroom in the store to wash my face and remove my elaborate makeup. Looking at my pale, lifeless self in the mirror, I gave a knowing smile. During the years I was married to Ethan, I was made up elaborately and dressed in high-end custom-made gowns whenever I attended an event. In fact, it was not comfortable at all. As the saying goes, the outside is golden, but the inside is rotten. Even so, I was still not accepted by those in the so-called circles. In fact, I should have been tired long ago. When I returned to the Blake family, Mrs. Blake's maid, Auntie Wong, was sitting on the sofa. She nodded slightly when she saw me. Auntie Wong had followed Mrs. Blake, my mother-in-law, for many years, and every time she came, she would convey Mrs. Blake's wishes. I walked towards her. She was sitting comfortably on the sofa, with no intention of getting up. As usual. Madam, the old lady said that starting today, we will be using a different recipe, she said, gesturing for the servant to bring a bowl of thick, smelly herbal soup. Her sharp gaze swept over my body, and when she saw me in my tracksuit, a flash of disdain crossed her eyes. Because Ethan and I had been married for 6 years without having a child, Mrs. Blake personally took me to the hospital to make sure I was fine before starting to make me drink the herbal soup to nourish my body. She thought it was because I was too weak to bear children. In fact, every time it was over, Ethan would personally make sure I took the birth control pills. He didn't want me to get pregnant. At first I thought he just didn't like children. Later I realized that he just didn't want me to give birth to his child with this face. I think it was because of his guilt towards Lily, his first love. I'm not sure. And Mrs. Blake drank this herbal medicine for 4 years. The herbal medicine was fishy, bitter, sour, and spicy. When I first started drinking it, I almost gulped it down with my nose pinched, and I could only suppress the taste by drinking several glasses of water afterwards. Every time the prescription was changed, I couldn't help but vomit as soon as I took a sip, along with the food I had eaten. Several times I secretly threw it away, but I don't know how Mrs. Blake found out. After that, the Blake family approached my parents. I don't know what method they used to convince my parents. My parents called me every day on time, like checking homework, and even demanded that I drink the medicine in front of them on video before they would stop. I drank it and vomited it, and vomited it and drank it. In the end, I developed a stomach problem, and my stomach was constantly accompanied by a burning pain and nausea. Over the past 6 years, I have spoken to Ethan many times. Each time he took it as a joke and forgot about it afterwards. I clenched my hands, and the pain in my fingers made me come back to my senses. Looking at Auntie Wong, who had always been so self-important, for the first time I rebelled. I slowly sat down on the sofa, and met Auntie Wong's furrowed brow. In the past, I regarded Mrs. Blake as an elder, and naturally I was respectful towards the people around her. I had never sat down in front of her before. Now it's different. I picked up a cup of tea and took a sip. I didn't even look at the soup. Just like that, Auntie Wong's face turned black. I smiled and said, "Auntie Wong, please tell Mrs. Blake that the reason I haven't gotten pregnant all these years is because her son, after every sexual encounter, has to see me finish the contraceptive pills with his own eyes before he'll let me leave. Her son is afraid to face reality and dares not admit anything." After listening to what I said in one breath, Auntie Wong stood up in shock. "Mrs. How can you say such things? Sir, it's..." I grabbed the words. My tone could not help but become a little excited. "It's what? Unfaithful? Treasonous? Or just plain bold?" It was the first time I had seen Auntie Wong look so panicked, and I felt a rush of pleasure. It turned out that not suppressing myself was so enjoyable. I ignored her. I went straight up to the second floor and packed my things simply. A small suitcase could hold all my belongings from the past 6 years. Looking at it, I smiled for some reason, until tears rolled down my face. There were no more traces of my life in the house, and I carried my things downstairs contentedly. "Mrs." The servants looked at each other, and I felt my heart warm slightly at their worried expressions. I had always treated them very well, so they would feel sad when I was punished by Mrs. Blake, and they would be heartbroken when I was yelled at by Ethan. I would go out and bring them back little gifts, and they would secretly make me cupcakes in the middle of the night that they had just researched. It can be said that their presence is the only warmth I have felt in the Blake family. I raised a smile and hugged each of them. I waved my hand behind my back. "Okay, I won't be back, and if you see me in the future, don't call me Mrs. Call me Sophie." As soon as I left the door, the sky started to drizzle. I didn't have an umbrella, so I walked straight into the rain without looking back. Ethan was sitting in a corner away from the noise. After 3 rounds of wine, he was a little drunk, but his eyes remained sober as they rested on the cold phone beside him. He frowned, realizing the moment he was waiting for something. He couldn't help but frown. After 6 years of marriage, this was the first time Sophie had thrown a temper tantrum, and she even embarrassed him in front of so many people. Perhaps he had indulged her too much, allowing her to act in such a way without any sense of propriety. Ethan couldn't help but clench his glass in his hand, thinking about the image of Sophie leaving in the end, without leaving him a glance or even the barely perceptible touch of relief. Boom! The glass was crushed. The sounds of gasps of worry and concern from all around made Ethan feel distracted for a moment. Looking at the faint oozing blood on his hand, his anger became more and more obvious. It's all fucking Sophie's. For several days, Ethan stayed in his hotel suite. For the first time, he didn't receive an apology from Sophie that day. In the suite, Ethan hung up the phone from Mrs. Blake. He looked calm, rubbing his phone, unable to tell his emotions. But suddenly the next second the phone was smashed to pieces. "Good, very good." Ethan suddenly lifted his eyes full of cold and piercing chill. The people in the box were shocked by his actions, but no one dared to ask what had happened. There was complete silence. A low, cold voice came from Ethan's thin lips, calling Sophie. The people nearby did not dare to delay. They immediately called her. Over and over. And over and over. The man who was making the calls could not stop trembling. He was filled with regret. He was usually the most insensitive person, and now, well, he was the quickest to react, and he was the one who got the worst luck. Ethan suppressed his anger and said, "Get lost." He let out a breath and immediately felt liberated. He clutched the phone in one hand and ran to the far end of the building. He ignored the people around him looking at him with pity. Ethan stubbed out his cigarette. He stood up abruptly, grabbed his jacket from the side, and disappeared into the night. When he returned home, he looked at the room, which had long since been cleared of all traces of Sophie's life, and his expression changed. Unconsciously, he brought anger to his face. Who cleaned up? The servant cowered, head bowed, and whispered, "It was Mrs. Bai who cleaned up and took it away." Ethan frowned. When did this happen? 5 days ago. It was the day Sophie had a fight. Ethan gritted his teeth and said, "What else did she say?" The servant bowed his head and said no more. His voice was cold and ruthless. The servant's voice trembled as he whispered. Mrs. Bai said, "Don't call her Mrs. Bai anymore, call her Sophie." Ethan's face showed no signs of emotion, but it somehow made people shiver. After a long while, Ethan let out a low laugh. A cruel smile curled the corner of his lips, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "Call the Lane family. If you don't see Sophie within 3 days, don't even think about Lane Corporation's investment this quarter." Ethan paused, and froze all the funds in Sophie's name. "I'll see how she begs to come back." Ethan hung up the phone, and tiredly pinched his eyebrows together. Sophie had gone too far this time, which made him feel annoyed from the bottom of his heart. This time, he would make her remember this lesson firmly, and never let her play it again. He was 100% sure that Sophie would be sent back in 3 days. After all, Sophie's parents couldn't wait to sell their daughter in the first place. He laughed at the thought. This stupid woman Sophie was sold off so easily. She had no idea that her parents' business was on the verge of bankruptcy at the time. If she hadn't happened to have a face like Lily's, and if he hadn't taken a fancy to her, she would probably be serving that old man right now. This thought made him feel irritated for some reason, so he shook his head to get rid of it. He subconsciously didn't want to think in that direction. The dark blue sea ebbs and flows like fine shimmering stars, which is very beautiful. During these few days of temporary residence, it is as if I have stolen some time, quiet and leisurely, undisturbed. I often sit in one place, staring curiously at everything. This seemingly ordinary everything has tacitly never appeared in my life. The past. I was like a soulless puppet, with no preferences and no choices. Everything from childhood to adulthood was arranged in a fixed pattern, including the way I thought, all of which came from my parents' indoctrination. The so-called good and bad were just the excellence or otherwise of my achievements within the field defined by my parents. Later, soon after graduating, I met Ethan. We got married quickly. It was also shackled in the so-called upper class. At that time, the standard of evaluation for women evolved into the extravagance of clothes and the value and status of their husbands. Everyone thought I was a masterful woman, and the jealous stares of the outside world never left me. But that was never what I wanted. I let out a breath, and my heart fluttered. Now, I no longer have to drink the dark, foul-smelling herbal medicine. I no longer have to kowtow to Mrs. Blake. I no longer have to look at Ethan's cold, always scowling face. I no longer have to wear heavy makeup and uncomfortable clothes, playing the part of an inauthentic noblewoman, away from a class that was never meant for me. It turns out that if you dare to be brave, everything can change, even if everyone else hates you. I joined the bonfire party that everyone was jumping around at the beach, and everyone's face was filled with heartfelt joy. This kind of happiness is something I have never allowed myself to have. I guess that the divorce papers had almost arrived. I pulled Ethan from the blacklist. After a ring, there was no answer. I frowned and tried again, and just as the ringtone was about to end again, the phone was answered on the other end. Was it Ethan? Yes. He never expected that the moment he received Sophie's call, he would be a little flustered, and even for a moment, he was a little at a loss. He answered the phone, but subconsciously held his breath, and all he could hear was Sophie's shallow breathing. His thoughts could not help but wander. It was the night of the wedding. The Blake family had many rules, especially for the bride. When Sophie finished kneeling before all the ancestors in the Blake family ancestral home, she was so tired that she yawned. Her mature and delicate makeup had slightly smudged. Perhaps it was because she looked a bit like Lily. He picked her up in his arms, and the soft and playful sound of her breathing came into his ears just like that. He actually listened to Sophie's breathing in bed all night, the whole night. Even he himself couldn't believe it. Thinking about this, his eyebrows twitched slightly, and an imperceptible trace of tenderness appeared at the corner of his lips. Just this once. He could forgive her for her temper tantrum that day, for leaving without saying goodbye these past few days, for telling on his mother, and even for the angry words she said to the servants. He felt that he had made peace with her far too easily. Would that be giving her too much face? If she did it again in the future, he would not forgive her so easily. Ethan thought it over and let out an imperceptible breath. Sophie, if you go home right now, I'll forget about it. But if you do it again in the future, don't blame me. Don't blame me for not wanting you anymore, Ethan thought to himself. But he felt that if he said those words, Sophie on the other end of the line might be so scared that she would burst into tears. So he didn't say them. All he heard was a pause in the breathing on the other end of the line. Then Sophie's gentle, clean voice arrived. Did it arrive? Inside is the divorce agreement I signed. Please sign it as soon as you can. Ethan's thoughts completely stopped at that moment, as if frozen by a huge block of ice, unable to think or act. Frowning, he said mechanically, say that again. I said, please sign the divorce agreement in the package as soon as possible. After 6 years we still don't suit each other. Since you have someone you like, let's divorce peacefully. Ethan couldn't hear the rest of what was said, and even if he could, he would have difficulty thinking. He could only hear the words divorce, divorce. It was as if he had suddenly lost all his emotions. For a long time, Ethan stated without emotion, your parents will never agree to this. Sophie on the other end of the line seemed to freeze for a moment. Ethan couldn't help but clench his phone in his hand, the white knuckles bulging as if waiting for the verdict of death or rebirth. From the other end of the line came Sophie's determined voice, one that Ethan had never heard before. Never mind them. I'm an adult. I've made my decision. Fine, I hope you don't come crawling back. He hung up the phone first. Furious and outraged, his chest heaved. This was the first time in nearly 30 years that he had been so angry.
How dare Sophie propose un divorce?
How dare she go ahead and file for divorce? It took a long time for him to regain his composure. He calmed down and thought. He never imagined that just a simple Emma could make Sophie say such an absurd thing as divorce. Sophie had no idea how many women there were out there who were business tycoons of the same or even lower status than him, and smart people should choose to turn a blind eye. And he had only held her hand in front of her. Moreover, they had been unequal from the beginning, and the fate of Lane Corporation was in his hands. It was Sophie who had failed to recognize her own position. Ethan lit a cigarette and narrowed his eyes. She can't tell the difference. There are people who can tell the difference. This time, he would never stop Sophie's parents from punishing Sophie. He waited for Sophie to beg for mercy. I rented a used off-road vehicle and set off for Tibet. In the rearview mirror, the man in the black windbreaker had his eyes slightly closed and his face was pale. I couldn't help but laugh. He still gets carsick like this. Jack was a senior in the same major as me in college, and we followed the same advisor at the time. We knew each other well, but after I graduated and married Ethan, I lost contact with him and all my friends and teachers from university. I met him alone at the Tangula Mountains. We sat around a folding table. He had severe altitude sickness and needed to breathe in some oxygen from time to time. His face was still slightly flushed after just breathing in the oxygen. He handed me a glass of water, and when our eyes met, he looked away first. His eyelashes were drooping, and I couldn't see his expression clearly. How have you been all these years? I swallowed hard, feeling a little embarrassed. Ethan, he's been bullying you, hasn't he? I turned my head and looked at Jack in surprise. I remembered that he had gone abroad after graduation. How did he know Ethan? For some reason, Ethan looked at the petite woman in front of him and had long lost the pity he had felt in the past. He just felt extremely irritated. Back in the box, she had crossed the line. And Ethan didn't like people who crossed the line. He wanted to be in control of everything. Of things and people. From now on, you don't need to show your face to me again. Emma was shocked beyond words by the indifference in Ethan's eyes. Clearly, they had had so much affection for each other, and just a few days ago it had been her who had taken the initiative for the first time. Could it be that because of this, he no longer wanted her? Mr. Blake, I never asked for any status. I don't want to leave you. Miss Brooks, I won't say this again. Don't worry, I'll make it up to you. Emma fell to the ground, powerless, and watched Ethan's receding back until it disappeared from her view. She knew that the position of Mrs. Blake was no longer hers to have. Ethan sat on the sofa, staring blankly at Sophie's handwriting in his hands. It was powerful and beautiful. She had a good handwriting, he never knew. Yes, he had long forgotten that Sophie was a student at a prestigious university. After completing her postgraduate studies, she wanted to continue her doctoral studies. But with his tacit approval, Sophie's parents had long since discouraged her from doing so and married him instead. In fact, it is possible to do a doctorate while married, but he tacitly agreed that a married woman should stay at home forever. Moreover, she married into the Blake family, so she should stay at home forever. Never mind, after all, he was wrong to do that to her. He decided to take the initiative to go find Sophie this time. As for the divorce, in his opinion, it was just a way to force him to give in first. He regretted the inappropriate behavior he had displayed when he heard the word divorce. After all, he had never seen his gentle and obedient wife really angry with anyone. He imagined Sophie's expression when she saw him later. Would she be surprised? Would she be happy? Or would she be smug? It didn't really matter. Right now, he just wanted to see her. Ethan hadn't left yet, when the butler came up to tell him that the Lane family had arrived. He immediately got up, but then thought of something else and slowly sat down again. He straightened the crease in his cuffs, picked up his phone and slid it a few times before setting it down again. The butler was a little confused for a moment. Sophie was much later than he expected her to be back, but he didn't know why Sophie's parents were letting her get away with it. Never mind, it didn't matter. Downstairs, he looked at the hall with only Sophie's parents, and his face instantly sank. Where is she? Sophie's parents immediately got up and said carefully, Mr. Blake, Sophie she hasn't returned home, and we don't know where she went. None of her calls were answered, but don't worry, we will let her go home as soon as she returns. We are really sorry we didn't educate her well. Ethan interrupted the two and asked the butler to show the guests out. The wind was blowing fiercely, making the clothes of Jack and I crackle. We had visited almost all the attractions in Tibet together. By the time we returned, we had been out and about for more than half a month. I looked at the wet and alluring Jack, his shirtless upper body with specks of water dripping from his tanned skin, swaying with his movements, forming strings that disappeared into the depths. I never imagined that the boy I remembered as skinny would now have a good figure that looked even better with clothes on. Jack, who was drying his hair, looked at me mysteriously and said, Sophie, wipe your drool. I hurriedly touched my lips, but I couldn't help but stare bored. I turned my head but blushed. Jack used the excuse that he had just returned to China and had nowhere to stay, and followed me all the way to the temporary rental apartment. I looked at him in his understated designer clothes and the expensive Rolex he had casually thrown on the sofa. I sighed and didn't expose his lie after all. I'm not a 17 or 18-year-old girl, and I'm not as dumb as I look. I understand Jack's intentions. We sat on the sofa and watched TV. From time to time, we talked about interesting things that happened at university. After a burst of laughter, Jack was the first to suppress his smile. He turned his head to me, his tone obscure. Sophie, I wrote you back that year. Why didn't you wait for me? My pupils twitched slightly. It was my sophomore year, and Jack was the popular guy on campus. Many girls had written him love letters because of his outstanding appearance and extremely attractive aloofness. College students are bound to be lost in beauty, and I wrote him a love letter for more than just that reason. During college, I was bound by my parents' traditional views, and I dressed like a little princess all the time. I was expressly forbidden to participate in all physical activities. There were strict requirements for my daily sitting posture, the types of food I could eat, etc. Because I was so different from everyone else. I was isolated. After I was bullied again, I hid away and went to my secret base to cry every time. Jack appeared and patted my head comfortingly. He said to me seriously, "Don't let your silence be a reason for others to hurt you endlessly." He shook my hand firmly. With his encouragement, I reported the matter to the police. The police summoned the perpetrator for serious charges, and the atmosphere in class never returned to normal. Everything worked out. I never imagined it would be so easy. From that moment on, I saw Jack as a ray of light in my life. His academic achievements also became the firm belief that I followed in his footsteps later. After graduating from graduate school, I wrote him a love letter. Unfortunately, it was like a stone dropped into the sea without a trace. A stone dropped into the sea. I looked at Jack sharply. I never received a reply to that love letter. Jack looked at my expression, as if weighing up whether it was true or not. In the end, his eyebrows and eyes crumpled into a ball. I muttered and opened my mouth, so it was my parents. I couldn't help but lower my head and fidget my fingertips. The atmosphere was a little awkward for a moment. A drop of water fell on the back of my hand. It was crystal clear. I couldn't help but look up, and met Jack's eyes full of surging joy. He crouched down and looked me in the eye. His warm hands grasped my waist. I trembled imperceptibly, but he sensed it keenly. He let out a soft laugh, and I quickly came back from my stupor. Unwittingly, I caught a glimpse of the tender affection in his eyes. My heart seemed to be hit by something, and it trembled more and more violently. He slowly moved closer to me. I could already clearly smell the unique fragrance of cold pine on him. I could smell the ground needles. Jack was as nervous as I was. The final moment. I finally tilted my head to the side. He sighed and buried his face in my neck. "I'm sorry, I can't do this yet." Jack didn't say anything, just tightened his arms around me. He refused to look up. Looking at him in my arms like a poor puppy, I felt guilty. I stroked his fluffy head. I said reassuringly, "You haven't even got the divorce papers yet, so how can I give you a title?" He suddenly looked up, his eyes shining. He jumped up and started spinning around me. I had never seen him look so happy. Okay. I patted him gently, watching his chest rise and fall. His whole face was filled with unadorned joy. My heart felt like it was flooded with warm waves, instantly filling it with tender emotions. How long had it been since I had felt such a straightforward display of love? Jack's reaction made me feel like a precious gem, and I truly felt valued. I liked it. Ethan easily found where Sophie lived. He was dressed in a black suit and was holding the flowers the butler had asked him to bring. He stared dreamily at the bright red flowers in his hands. Suddenly he burst out laughing. He had never given flowers to a woman before, not even Lily. He had never bothered to please a woman because in his opinion, only useless men did so. Even though he thought so. He rearranged the position of the bouquet. He took it upstairs. Ethan arrived just as Jack finished his shower, and was getting ready to watch a movie with me. The doorbell rang. Jack hurried to answer the door. I couldn't help but laugh. Ever since I told him that the divorce papers would be arriving soon, he always runs to the door when he hears it. Is it the divorce papers he's been waiting for? Ethan was almost out of his mind when he opened the door, and saw the handsome man with his shirt off. He let out a yell, "Sophie!" The grapes in his hand fell one after the other to the floor, and I calmly picked them up and threw them in the trash. I wiped my hands before walking towards the door. I smiled politely and distantly at him. "Ethan, long time no see." Ethan's flowers in his hand fell to the ground. His eyes were full of shock and disbelief. Following his gaze, I touched my neck. He saw the marks on my neck. Although they were mosquito bites, they were red and swollen for a long time. I think he must have misunderstood. However, I have no intention of explaining. "Did you bring the divorce agreement?" Ethan spoke slowly but clearly. "Sophie, don't be silly. Your parents are still waiting for you at Blake Family. Don't let them down." A threat or a warning? Ethan is very clever. He knows that I have always listened to my parents and I can't bear to see the disappointment in their eyes. But things are different now. In the past, I have given up too much, sacrificed too much for Lane Corporation. The years I spent with the Blake family are cancelled out by the benefits the Blake family gave to the Lane family. From now on we owe each other nothing. The future of Lane Corporation depends on them. Survival of the fittest. What he meant was that I would no longer compromise for Lane Corporation and my parents. Ethan frowned and whispered, I've already broken up with Emma, and I've already dealt with all those other things. From now on, this will never happen again. But in the face of the current situation, it seems that he has no choice. He gave Jack a look and then returned to me, suppressing his anger. Only this time I could pretend I didn't see it. I have never seen such a submissive Ethan. His things he has never let others touch. He would rather throw them away and destroy them than let others get even half of them. Now he has changed his attitude. However, everything about him is none of my business. It's impossible for us. After saying that, his face suddenly changed, his anger rising, but I could faintly hear a few sobbing sounds coming from his throat. But the voice was very small. Ethan's face was a little hideous. Have you thought it through? You know my temper. If I leave today, I will never come back, Sophie. He emphasized my name. I looked at him calmly and then nodded solemnly. Go back. I'll wait for your divorce papers. The evening breeze ran up the corridor, and in one glance I felt a little cooler. Jack casually picked up a blanket nearby and put it firmly over me. Ethan looked deeply at Jack, and then turned to look at me. Then he disappeared from our sight. I watched him leave. 6 years from 20 to 30. Did I like Ethan? I think I did. When Lane Corporation was about to go bankrupt, I overheard my parents' arrangement for me in the study. A business tycoon the same age as my father was my future. Although I was sad, I knew I had no choice but to accept it. Until the party hosted by the Blake family, Ethan noticed me at once. He was getting married. As a newlywed, I was full of girlish shyness and repeatedly made advances towards him. But he was unmoved. He even allowed other women to provoke him time and time again. Ethan's mother deliberately made things difficult for him, but he remained unmoved. It seems that the little bit of love that was born has slowly faded away over these past 6 years. Love that is not even worthy of sprouting has just vanished, leaving behind endless perfunctory actions and pain. A few tears slide down my face. Jack, who is standing next to me, has a dark face, but his eyes are full of restrained pity, and he gently kisses away the tears. He says angrily, he's rubbish, he treats you badly, you mustn't cry for him. In the future you can only cry for me. No, in the future you mustn't cry for anyone. As I listened to his serious and rambling explanation of his own twisted logic, I couldn't help but laugh. Ethan never deliberately delayed, and the divorce agreement was delivered the next day. Someone's spirit is in an extreme state of excitement all day. He solemnly framed the divorce agreement and placed it in the most conspicuous place in the bedroom so that he could view it from time to time. I couldn't stop laughing at his manipulation. In the evening, Ethan looked at me without blinking, ready to go. I could hear him swallow. His voice was hoarse. It was late. I looked at the scarlet in Jack's eyes and my heart fluttered. The bed was white. Jack tempted me again and again. Whenever I was about to fall asleep, he gave me a wicked jolt. It seemed to go on forever. Once again he sent me to the peak. No, I can't anymore, Jack. I can't. He leaned down and gave my lips a kiss like a dragonfly. Then he returned to the battlefield. His breath was on my ear, his voice coated with seductive lust. How could I not? Sophie is the best. Sophie is the best. Repeat after me. Jack's voice was getting hoarse. I swallowed, my mind already a little unclear. I just kept obeying his orders. Sophie is the best. Sophie is the best. The man on top of me clutched me tightly, as if he wanted to imprint himself into my bones. His voice was frighteningly low as he said, Sophie is the best. Sophie is the best. Boom. A wave of heat swept over my lower abdomen, and I could no longer hold on and fainted. When I woke up again, it was already the afternoon of the next day. I felt like my body was falling apart. It was obvious how crazy last night was. Jack brought breakfast to my bed, looking guilty. I knew that I would have to endure a lot of bed sharing in the days to come. Jack's perspective. That girl Sophie has been bullied again. She looks like a little princess, but she's actually a crybaby. She snuck into my territory again and started crying. I couldn't stand it anymore, so with my encouragement, she finally dared to call the police. Since then, she's become a bit more lively. Every time we meet, she greets me politely. It was worth it to privately beat up those in her class who were thinking of bullying her again. After graduation, I received a love letter from her. I loved it. It was so hard for the crybaby to take this step. This shows how much she liked me. I immediately wrote her back. I was afraid of delaying for a while. Unfortunately, it was like a stone sinking into the sea. When I couldn't help but go find her, I heard from her circle that she had gotten married. Everyone said they were a perfect match. I was devastated for a long time. Eventually, I went abroad. Until I learned of their relationship problems. Looking at Sophie's circle of friends, I set off. Under the Tangula Mountains, she met me alone. Naturally, I got into her car. And then stayed at her house. Eventually, the misunderstanding was resolved. So, step by step, I used a combination of persuasion, hard work, and the occasional glimpse of my abs to seduce her. I married my beloved wife. Her smelly ex-husband tried to steal her away. No chance. I guarded every aspect of our relationship jealously. Every now and then, I would show a sad expression, and my wife would fall for me all over again. Hee hee. Of course, I also had to put in the effort in bed. I couldn't let my wife stop, or it would be my fault. Later, we had a child. Finally, I didn't have to be afraid of my wife leaving me. However, I was a little dissatisfied. Because my wife's attention had turned to the baby again. I pretended to be serious and told my wife that she must teach the baby to be independent from an early age. So, naturally, I found a nanny and left her to raise the baby on her own. I embraced my wife in my arms. I coaxed her, "Wifey, kiss your wifey and do it again." My wife gave me a gentle tap on the chest and said with gritted teeth, "That's the third time you've said that." Heh. My wife's happiness is about to begin again. From Ethan's perspective, everyone around me kept saying that Sophie looked like Lily, so when I married Lily, everyone around me kept saying that I was deeply in love and would be faithful until death. I laughed all the way. But when I saw Sophie's gentle and soft appearance as always, I stopped trying to clarify my thoughts. There was no doubt that I loved Sophie, but a woman is ultimately a little too bland. So, I did what almost every man would do. Maybe I really irritated Sophie that day. She even lost her temper. For some reason, I felt a little happy inside. But in the end, I was overwhelmed by her coldness in the next few days. How dare she leave the house without permission? How dare she go to her mother's place and reveal my secret? How dare she tell the servants not to call her madam? I was furious. So, I will make her regret it. I asked her parents to pressure her. Cut off her finances. But I waited a long time, and she still didn't come back, still didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't go back to Lane family, and she stopped listening to her parents. For the first time, I panicked. Everything during this period completely took me by surprise. Vaguely, it felt like something was about to leave me. I couldn't hold on to it. During this period, she told me that she wanted a divorce. I could no longer control myself and went to find her. For the first time in 6 years, I bowed my head. But she had found someone else. At that moment, I clearly felt a tingling sensation in the pit of my left breast. It almost consumed me. When she looked at me, the indifference in her eyes let me know that I no longer had a chance. I had lost my wife, the wife who had been with me for 6 years. Before I left, I saw a large bouquet of flowers in the living room, still glistening with morning dew. It was much more beautiful and fresh than the bouquet I had brought. They must have chosen it carefully. It was different from the one I was holding. Later, they got married. The wedding was very grand. The parents of the man named Jack also returned from abroad. They were also from a wealthy family. At that time, I still had a glimmer of hope that if Jack's parents didn't like her, and with the passage of time their feelings would fade, perhaps Sophie would return to me. But that day never came. Jack's parents treated them with enough respect that they returned to their home country after the wedding. Later they had a child. I saw it, and its features were very similar to Sophie's. I saw them again a long time later. They were walking hand in hand on the street, their faces beaming with happiness, and Jack was holding their child. But their eyes were glued to Sophie. She had left me and found someone who looked at her all the time. The sun was setting, and they walked together towards the afterglow. I sat in the car watching them go. A fine sharp pain rose in my heart, and I regretted it,